We're going to move on to the next presentation. So I think it's my turn to ask Ellen to introduce her PhD student.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to introduce Katherine Bird, who is a PhD student working with me in the self-harm research group at the University of Nottingham. And Katherine's undertaking really important work on self-harm, and she's adapting the card sort task for self-harm, which we've developed in our group for young people who are at high risk. And she's asked me to give a content warning this morning that her talk will discuss both self-harm and suicide throughout. And so I'm going to hand over to Katherine.
Thank you, Ellen. Good morning. As Ellen said, my name is Katherine and I'm a second year PhD student at the University of Nottingham. I'll give you a brief background of self-harm and suicidality in the high-risk groups, which are the focus of my PhD research, and then I'll discuss the aims of my PhD, what I've achieved so far and what my next steps are. So self-harm is a significant public health concern, both here in the UK and worldwide. It's particularly prevalent in adolescents, with research indicating around half of adolescents will self-harm at least once. It's got serious impact on people's health, so it reduces both physical and mental health and impacts general well-being. But most worryingly is that self-harm is the most significant predictor of death by suicide, with around half of people who do die by suicide having a history of self-harm. So considering this, reducing self-harm is a key suicide prevention strategy. So some groups are at particularly high risk of self-harm compared to the general population, and these two groups are the focus of my PhD, and they are trans youth and young people with disordered eating. With trans youth, around half of them will engage in self-harm, and they're at increased risk of self-harm compared to their cisgender peers. And cisgender is a person whose birth assigned gender is the same as their gender identity. And similarly, with young people with disordered eating, the comorbidity of those two conditions increases the severity of symptoms, and it also increases suicide risk in young people. Now, previous research has identified many risk factors for self-harm that often precede self-harm, so things like stressful life experiences, depression, maltreatment, and people often experience many risk factors on their pathway to self-harm. But previously they've been researched in isolation as one single factor or with one other factor. But this limits our understanding because it doesn't kind of take into account the multitude of factors that a person experiences as they self-harm. And it also limits the predictive value of risk assessments because, again, focus is placed on one or two risk factors. Little is known about what tips someone from thinking about self-harm to actually engaging in self-harm, and little is understood about why people might engage in alternative behaviours, so things like reading or calling a friend, or it could be detrimental like binge drinking. And my PhD aims to address these gaps in knowledge using the card sort task for self-harm, which we refer to as CATS, which I will do so from now on. And it's developed by a team, including my supervisor, Ellen, and it takes into account the many and varied factors experienced by people who self-harm, and it allows people to systematically describe their own pathway in self-harm. So the picture on the right there is one that I've done myself, just to show you. So along the top, you've got timestamps, so from 6 months prior, right down to I self-harmed and then afterwards. And then underneath, that people are able to place cards that are relevant to their experience. So there are events, thoughts, feelings, behaviours, things like I had an argument with my parent, I felt ignored, I had access to means. There were blank cards if people feel that there's something that isn't explained in the cards already that they can add on. And the aim is that this tool will help both client and clinician to identify meaningful targets for interventions for that person. And previously, it's been used when CATS has been used in research. It's been done in person. So a young person will actually be with a researcher in a room, and they'll have laminated cards, and they'll sort of manually, physically do the card sort task. But this is quite time consuming. It limits the number of participants that can take part and when they can take part. So during my PhD, I'll create an online version of CATS so it can be used, online, and we can reach more participants. Now, as I said, I'm in the second year of my PhD. I'm on a 4-year pathway. So last year was largely a training year. I undertook some compulsory and some chosen modules, which helped me develop existing skills, but also develop new research skills. The compulsory modules taught me some advanced research methods and also skills such as preparing a research paper for publication. And the chosen modules were individual and group interviews and systematic reviews. And I'm already using these methods in my PhD, so they've been really beneficial to me. And alongside those modules last year, I started working on a systematic review of the risk and protective factors for self-harm and suicidality in trans people. So it's well documented that trans people are at increased risk of self-harm. This is because they experience general risk factors like depression and group-specific factors like transphobia, which increases their risk. There's also emerging evidence that protective factors like social support may reduce that self-harm in trans people. But what is clear is that trans people have a very distinct pathway to self-harm. They have unique challenges, and better understanding factors associated with trans harm is essential to identify meaningful targets for intervention that are appropriate for trans people, and also to develop tools which can better capture and assess trans self-harm risk. Historically, trans self-harm has been researched under the wider LGBTQ+ umbrella, but this is problematic considering those unique challenges that they face. So this systematic review aims to synthesize the understanding of the risk and protective factors for self-harm as experienced by trans people. And it also seeks to clarify the relationship between risk and protective factors, including whether protective factors do reduce self-harm risk. And this is really important to better understand how those factors influence the trans self-harm and identify gaps in our understanding that can be addressed in future research. But it's also important in the development of CATS as a tool, because the cards may need to be changed to ensure they're appropriate to capture the trans self-harm pathway. So 30 papers have been identified and included in the review. And as you can see from the slide, they cover a wide age range. They're from all over the world. So largely they were survey studies, and most of them were conducted in the community. Now this review is still underway, and more findings will be added to this, but so far I've identified 3 key findings. And the first one is that there's significant heterogeneity of risk and protective factors investigated. This makes it really difficult to generalise findings across the trans population. For example, transphobia was found to be significantly associated with self-harm, but that was only investigated by one study. So we can't, from that one study, we can't use it as evidence to apply it to the wider population. Secondly, studies largely investigated general risk and protective factors. So the impact of trans-specific factors, like transphobia, is less well understood. So again, hard to generalise across the trans population. And finally, there is some indication that protective factors, especially family and social support, does mitigate self-harm risk, but so few studies investigated protective factors. So again, it's really hard to generalise across the trans population. So the ultimate key recommendation at this stage is that more research is needed to reduce the heterogeneity and to investigate trans-specific factors and to investigate protective factors. Alongside the review, I'm also planning a series of focus groups to capture trans views of the existing CATS task as it is. Measures used to investigate trans issues are often cis-centred and they're not validated in trans populations. And this raises questions about how effectively they can capture trans experiences. It's essential to ensure that CATS is appropriate and meaningful to trans people and trans self-harm if it's going to be a useful tool and that's capable of reducing self-harm and improving their health and wellbeing outcomes. So I'm planning a small focus group study to capture their views of CATS, and the aim of the sessions is to explore the meaningfulness and suitability and acceptability of CATS for trans people, and also to explore potential changes to CATS to increase the suitability. I'm currently awaiting ethical approval for this, so as soon as that has been granted, I'll be able to start recruiting for this study. So my next steps are, I'm also going to be doing a focus group study which is exactly the same, but with young people with disordered eating, capture their views of CATS and how it can capture their self-harm. I'm currently writing the ethics application for that. And also the next big step is to begin developing the online version of CATS. Now I have already been doing work on this over the last year, and when I started my PhD I envisaged that it would be done on a desktop in much the same way as you would do it if you were doing it sort of physically. So I started using software like this, which is basically it's like post-it notes that you can move around online that you can use on your desktop. And I started to develop using Adobe the cards that we could use to insert into this post-it note software. However, I did a bit more reading, and actually from that it became apparent that desktop access varies significantly, and a lot of young people actually don't have access to a desktop, or they don't have access frequently or regularly. And also that young people much prefer apps, or an app type access. 95% of teens and young people have their own smartphone. So considering that, it became obvious to me that actually an app version of CATS would be far preferable and far more appropriate for use in young people. So I'll be developing an app version of CATS rather than a desktop version of CATS. And I'm going to begin work in the next couple of weeks with the computer science team at the University of Nottingham to develop the app. And once that has been completed, I'll actually be able to use it for the main study of my PhD, which is to examine the pathways to self-harm and suicide in the high-risk groups using the app version of the card sort task. So thank you very much.
Brilliant, thank you, Katherine. It looks like you're going to be very busy.
I just have actually one more slide as well, just to kind of to finish what Ellen said at the beginning, that obviously it's a very sensitive topic, and just if anyone, just reminded that there is help out there if anyone is affected, and there is support if everyone needs it.
Thank you, and thank you for pointing us in the direction of those important charities. If you come off slide share, then it will make it easier for me to see who that got their hand raised, but I know Peter has, so maybe you could go first with the question for Katherine.
Yeah, sorry, me again. I guess just to say, I think it's a really important area of research. We've done, I think the whole idea of not just treating LGBTQ people as one group, but thinking more in terms of subgroup is vital. So we've done a little bit of work around self-harming bisexual people, and again, sort of unique challenges and difficulties that don't necessarily run across the kind of wider LGBTQ population. It was more a kind of comment, I guess, than a question, just to say that I think a really key thing here is that we start to think more about how we sort of record gender within studies, because in theory we could easily get a huge sort of shared data set across self-harm research around gender and self-harm, but most people just have male, female, or other, and so it really limits our ability, especially when looking at kind of more of a minority group. And so it's certainly something I've been wondering about more recently, and we've kind of played around with different ways of recording that in terms of demographics, and probably still figuring out the best way of doing it. But I mean, good to get your thoughts, but I think something around trying to make sure as a kind of community of researchers we better record this information means there's more opportunity for data sharing and secondary analysis of this kind of stuff. So I'll leave that there, I guess.
Yeah.
Comment on.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, that's a really important point, isn't it, for us as a community? I think Nicola has a question.
Thank you, Vanessa, and thank you, Katherine, for a really interesting talk. I'm a qualitative mental health researcher, so I was particularly interested in hearing about the card sorting task that you're using. I think it's a really excellent way of easily capturing some quite rich ideas, qualitative ideas, and I like the fact that you've got these blanks in it where people can put in stuff that is perhaps more meaningful for them. I think I had a couple of comments around that. I like that you were doing the particular focus on trans people and sort of tailoring and assessing how meaningful or relevant it is for them. But I equally thought you could do a similar process with in fact, all young people, just to sort of check that, the sort of usability, the meaningfulness of it applies to everybody. And I think, I mean, this may be beyond the scope of the PhD. I can see that you're using it as both as a research tool, but I think you're also developing it as a sort of clinical or self-management type intervention. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more, for those of us who don't know, about, what you see as the the ways forward for using a card sort task as an intervention, really. I think it's really interesting, but I don't know much about it.
Yeah, it's for my PhD, where it is sort of as a research tool, and it's sort of fairly in the fairly early-ish stages. So it is primarily a research tool, but I think sort of moving forward, I think it would be really useful as a tool, because young people can, it can be made really bespoke, so they can really describe their own experience from their perspective. You know, factors that might not be important to me or you or anybody else may be really, really key tipping points to that person. And you know, it would be remiss to ignore them. So I think it could be a really useful tool to be able to, you know, that people can use with you, maybe with a clinician, maybe potentially, you know, get moving forward in years to come on their own, and to be able to identify certain points that are, you know, okay, I recognize that this is when this starts to happen, that is going to be a significant, you know, soon after I will then self-harm, and say I know that now that I need to do something around that time. So as a clinical tool, I think it would be really useful for really identifying those, because you can, you know, obviously you can look at well-known general evidence-based risk factors, which are evidence-based, and they are experienced by many people, things like anxiety and experiencing physical trauma, you know, things like that. But there might be other smaller things that are very individual. So I think it'd be really useful to help people to identify, and also to get to know their own experience better, because you don't always reflect on your own experience until it's much later. But I think it'd be useful for children, well, for young people, to actually be able to use it to reflect and get to know their own journey better.
Thanks, Katherine. We've got 3 more questions. If we could take them quickly, that would be brilliant. So Layla, you're next.
Hi, I was also very interested in the method you were using. It sounded interesting, and I just wondered if you could tell us a bit more about it in terms of how it works, and particularly how you analyze it. You said, I thought you said focus groups, but it's an individual task, is it?
No, so I'm using, so it is a task that someone would do individually. So moving forward, when I've developed the app, somebody would do it as, you know, they would do it individually. But prior to that stage, the focus groups that I'm planning at the moment are just really to assess, to get the views of the 2 high-risk groups and what they think of the existing CATS task as it is, and, you know, are the concepts meaningful and relevant to those 2 groups? Are there things that maybe need to be changed slightly? So the focus groups are to ask them their views and to assess the suitability of CATS prior to then developing it to use later on in my PhD.
Brilliant, thank you. And Stephen?
Thank you. First of all, it's a fantastic talk and really, really interesting. So thanks for that. And my question was really following on from Nicola's, and it was just to ask you to whether what your views on were about how doing the CATS task affects sort of thinking, understanding, and the behaviour of young people who take part, who do it, and whether it has sort of some sort of effects on behaviour, and whether those effects might vary depending on whether it's done in person with someone else or online, both potentially positive and negative.
So I think, if I remember correctly, Ella might be able to nod ahead if I'm correct. I think that first of all, talking about self-harm, and actually some research that some colleagues have done about asking young people about taking part in self-harm research. Taking part in self-harm research and talking about self-harm does not increase the likelihood that someone will self-harm. There's some suggesting that there is a cathartic impact of actually taking part in self-harm research. So obviously, you know, it's a sensitive topic, so there are always sort of wellbeing plans and things like that are in place to support people should they become distressed by it. And obviously online that is a bit more difficult because they're online, but yeah, there's certainly not the evidence to suggest that taking part in such research does increase the likelihood that someone will self-harm. I hope that answers your question.
Great. And Giuliano, if you've got one quick question, that'd be great.
All right, really quickly, first of all, great presentation, I hear that,
Thank you.
but definitely worth looking at the psychosis literature about card sorting, because it's kind of, you know, what people do. And actually often it's the process, it's not even the cards actually, it's the conversations that people have outside that, that's really important. So, you know, when you said about you can reach more, it's worth kind of thinking about sometimes the disadvantages of that. The second thing is, but there is a whole literature around that, and that's what's really good. And just to kind of pick up on Stephen's stuff in terms of it's about demystifying those issues. If I'm not going to be talking to you about my self-harm, who am I going to be talking to?
Yeah.
I need you to do that. And then the other thing was just going back to Peter's stuff as well, which I think is really important around not all groups have access to this. So really thinking around your focus groups and making sure you're considering the intersectionality, you know, in terms of if you're coming from a Black and minority ethnic group and you're having these issues, which people do, but people don't think you're allowed to do that, making sure that their voices are kind of feeding into that.
Yeah, no, that's
really, really important. Because this is a massive issue. It's an absolute massive issue in our younger groups. And you can see how that differs if you're in the city compared to if you're in different areas or even just in different groups. So this is such a good piece of work.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for your comments as well. It's really useful.
Thank you. Everyone's really engaged with this topic, Katherine. And people, if you've got other questions for Katherine outside, maybe contact her separately. But thank you for your brilliant questions. It's been really fantastic. And